too. All right, thanks everybody. Welcome to June 16th Urban Forestry Commission meeting for the city of Portland, where we have a smaller group today, but we're a mighty group. I think we're going to be able to get through an agenda that is combination of urban forestry report and trees and development. It's an overview. Lucky to be joined by Bill Cunningham today from Bureau of Planning Sustainability. I think we'll probably lead and facilitate, or I'll facilitate that conversation, but Bill will kind of give us a rundown. We have a good amount of time set aside for that, but we also have a little time for future agenda items. And as you all recall, we had a retreat, or yeah, Melinda, we missed you there. We had a retreat recently, and it was an opportunity for us to surface a number of concepts, issues, concerns, and really overall kind of strategy making process. And we surfaced a lot of it knowing that we weren't going to be able to resolve all of it, of course. And so what we agreed to, just to remind you and remind myself, is to make sure we kind of follow up on each of those items that we brought up in the subsequent Urban Forestry Commission meetings. We had the really great privilege of getting together for about almost 4 hours to talk shop, and that, I think, allowed us to at least set up a agenda for things that are coming. And one of the things I think that's going to be really productive is we're going to have a set of monthly meeting items. There's some things that have to go to council at particular times, for example, heritage trees, annual reports, things like that. So we want to come up with a schedule that's about 6 months out that we're going to be kind of fleshing out. And then this future agenda items conversation today can help to seed some of those conversations coming up in the coming months. So without any further ado, and unless there's anything else that commissioners want to say about the retreat, I think I'd like to move into public comments. Right. Brian, anybody signed up for public comments?
No, no, I haven't received any public comments, and looks like no one's raising their hand in the attendees list, so we have to keep moving.
Okay. We'll also welcome Ashley and Rick to the Urban Forestry Commission meeting. Thank you, Urban Forestry staff, for joining. Let's get started then. If there's no public comments, and we're going to skip the minutes. Wow, we are swimming today. I would like to move it over. The reason we're not doing minutes, just to recap, is because we don't have quorum right now with commissioners, so we can't vote on anything. And that's usually what we would do. So we're going to kick these minutes that Brian sent from, I think Ashley and Brian sent, I think it was from, let me see here, from March, right? We have the March minutes here, and we'll move those to our July vote, and hopefully we'll have quorum there so we could actually vote on that. So let me, for the first time, I just want to record this, Jen, first time getting this over to you, actually a minute early, so the floor is yours. I have to celebrate those moments, of course, as a facilitator.
Woohoo! Great, thanks, Vivek. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for attending and participating in the retreat, and for all your time and thoughtfulness. And as Vivek said, we'll be continuing on to activate that work with you all in the coming weeks. Going back a little, last month, the annual Tree Code Trust Funds report was presented and accepted at council. And also the heritage tree, a group of heritage tree listings, new trees that are heritage trees, and delistings were approved by council. So thank you all for your contributions on those. The commission is always involved in those things. And also to the lead staff in those areas, which are Nikhilesh Desai, Angie DeSalvo, and Brian. Then some updates on things that have been in my report before. So the Water Bureau's administrative rule, which I'm looking at newer commissioners and thinking, oh, you're not going to know what that's about. So very quick background. The Water Bureau has proposed an administrative rule that would prohibit street tree planting within 10 feet of a large water main that's defined as something that's 24 inches diameter or larger under a complete street, which is a street with pavement, curbs, sidewalks. And that would eliminate a whole lot of tree planting spaces where trees are currently and won't be forever, of course, because they're living things that will decline and have to leave us at some point, as well as currently vacant spaces. So we have been working with the Water Bureau and some of you have as well, commenting on those tree impacts. And at present, there has been no motion on that. That rule, to my knowledge, hasn't been promulgated. And we continue to discuss with Water Bureau and trying to find ways to get on the same page as a city. There's also the Streets 2035 project, sort of master planning, so to speak, the design of streets in Portland. That's led by the Bureau of Transportation. And you've seen presentations on that a couple times and will again. That project continues. If it seems like it's slow moving, it's because it is. It's a really big project. And it also, in a way, kind of incorporated the updates to the pedestrian design guide. So in that way, it's actually sped right along because those have been approved by council and are now being implemented, or implementation is planned. I wanted to say, shifting to another area, something that's not about policy directly for you all, but may be of interest because it is impactful on policies. And I wanted to talk for a minute about software. We have had a multi-year request in to get a tree asset management and workflow software system in place for our entire division's use. There isn't such a thing right now. And in fact, a significant part of our work is done on paper documents, piles of paper in boxes, papers getting scanned, which of course is oh so 1980s. So obviously that's a really important step to take. I'm happy to say that with the Parks Operations Levy funding, this is one of the deliverables that can now be funded, and Parks is planning to work on that. That work hasn't really started yet. We're eager to see it happen. This really impacts, though, literally everything we do. How we know what we've done, how we track actions on a tree. When was that tree planted? What type of maintenance was done? By whom? Are there permits associated with it? For street trees, for which we're the responsible manager, even though the adjacent property owner is the responsible maintainer, as well as all the city property, trees and parks and other properties. So I hope at some point to be able to say, wow, we have a great software system, and maybe even show you a little bit. It'll make things much more efficient for our team, and we'll have better data tracking, documentation, and analytics, which we have very little of right now. Another item, I wanted to know, commissioners, do you all receive tree bark? Does that ring a bell? Great, good, thank you. Tree bark has a lot of information in it that I usually don't focus on in my report for the sake of time and because it seems a little redundant that it's in there, but I wanted to make sure you're all getting it. Thank you, glad to know you are. And would ask that when it hits your inbox, if you could give it a glance at least. There's a lot of really good information there. Right now, for example, there's some information about Youth Conservation Crew, Tree Crew, which is a program that we've had now for something like 20 years. That's in effect a workforce development program for paid summer employment for youth. Also, dun, 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 very exciting, we are kicking off street tree inventory again. It's time to update the inventory. Many commissioners, current and past, have been involved in that. I think it's a great bit of fun if you want to join in. There's information on when and how to do that in tree bark. And then also I wanted to point out, tree bark is where most of our public events, outreach, education, volunteering opportunities are. And there's one in particular coming up this Saturday I wanted to highlight for you. That is with the Juneteenth Oregon celebration. And we have some openings there. If you're interested in volunteering, you're certainly not expected to. You're already volunteering as commissioners in this meeting. But if you're interested, it's a great opportunity to connect with folks about free yard trees and planting opportunities available starting this fall again, volunteer opportunities for them, education opportunities for them, promoting trees, promoting tree-related resources that they can access for free from the city. And of course, it's also, as it is Juneteenth, Oregon, the celebration of Freedom Day. It's the holiday that commemorates the 1800s announcement of the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of African-American slaves, and it celebrates Black American history. And this year, in case you didn't know, very important, 2022 marks the first year the state of Oregon will recognize the date as an official state holiday. And it's also an opportunity to meet our outreach specialist, Daniel Moya, one of our outreach specialists, who's leading the event and is relatively new to urban forestry. And then finally, my last item for you is about today's presentation, Trees and Development. This has been something that some of you have asked for. It's a kind of complicated area of the tree code that our tree inspectors, tree technicians, and our permitting and regulation group, including Rick Faber, who's here today, work in every day. So you have some good expertise available to you. But one of the reasons I wanted to point out why this is a good opportunity for commissioners is this can really help inform what you all will advise in terms of content for the updated Portland Urban Forest Management Plan and future more substantive tree code amendments. So understanding how this all works now is a good way for you all to think about how it might be different or improved or better, identify questions you have, and start bringing those up now. So in the long run, we're really well prepared to work on those two big projects. And we're thinking that if you're interested, we may have similar types of opportunities and agenda items in the future to help build up that baseline for that work in the future. That ends my report. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Okay. We can go around, and if you don't have a question for Jen, we can just pass, but let's go around. Circle here, or at least this rectangle, I guess. Maybe start with Bruce. Do you want to start, and then we'll go to Melinda and Leah and Adrian and Jeanette?
So Jen, on the software issue, I know that was one of the selling points in passage of the parks levy. And is it just that other things have been a priority? I mean, it's been a year and a half now since that was passed, and parks still hasn't gotten to it. Is it not a priority for them, or it's just other things have been more important?
Good question, Bruce. You know, we've been asking for this for 10 years, which, like, my first week of work, I went, what? Paper? No, data? The reality is that there are many competing priorities at one time. This is a big lift also. It's something that we in urban forestry, you know, we need to be there as like the users, like what we need to see, be able to do. But it's really run by others in our bureau, our IT team, information technology team, and also importantly, the city's Bureau of Technology Services has a big role to play, and there's a lot of process getting new software in place. So all those things are playing a part, but ultimately there are a lot of priorities, and they're, as there often are, they're competing for folks' time in the bureau and elsewhere. So and one of my roles is to keep bringing it up.
So is it appropriate then for through various channels to try to get public concern expressed on this matter to the appropriate people like Commissioner Rubio and Director Long to see if they can expedite the procedure a bit, or do you think that would be counterproductive? Good
question, Bruce. I'm not entirely sure about that, because you're right, it could go either way. I will tell you that you being interested in it, having follow-up questions and expressing concern that it is a competing priority, I certainly can bring that forward to Bureau leadership, and that's helpful. Brian, your hand's up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and I was just going to note that the levy was passed November 2020, but funding didn't actually become available and approved by council until this past November, December. So we've been in the ramp up period of hiring and ordering equipment, and then also obviously trying to get this software piece in place for about the last six months. So just to clarify the timeline there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Melinda, come around to you.
Yeah, I was wondering about the timeline to resolve the street tree issue with the Water Bureau, the
Mhm.
utilities. Just
Yeah,
upcoming, you know, if there's kind of something laid out.
there is no timeline, Melinda, currently from the Water Bureau on like when they're going to go ahead and promulgate their administrative rule, or if they're delaying it because of this or other factors. Their administrative rule has many things in it that are not specifically this item. So we'll have to see how that goes. We continue to be present and bring the issue up and try to seek ways to meet their needs and perceptions as well as our tree needs and perceptions. That's why I keep y'all posted, because there is no set timeline that I'm aware of. And that rule could get promulgated really at any time, and we would continue to work on it from a different perspective then. I don't know if Brian or Rick, you have anything to add, which you may not. Feel free. It looks like a no.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I had.
All right. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you.
Leah?
I think I'll just second Bruce's urging that the data software seems really important, and it also makes me think about the work that Vivek's doing at PSU and how great would it be to have these data sets to also add to the data that he's collecting with his colleagues to understand what's going on with trees and you know, also things like, you know, I know we have data already about like trees and their if they survived a certain amount of time, but I feel like this seems like it would be probably a better approach to have it like in a computer, not in a stack of paper. So yeah, it does seem, I agree, it seems really important, and I hope that will get funded soon.
Thank you, Leah. And of course, our meeting minutes from today will reflect that. As I said, I'll bring that forward, that it's an area of interest and concern from the commission. And just to be clear too, we do have software, unfortunately multiple software systems, none of which do exactly what we want, and a paper system. So I think at last count we had about 6 different systems we're working in, which, you know, if that sounds inherently inefficient, it is. So we're looking for the one ring to rule them all, so to speak, or at least fewer. But some things are not on paper, some things are.
Thanks, Leah. Adrian?
Yeah, a ditto on the data. That sounds amazing. I'm just also wondering what kind of summative data you think you'll be able to get out of the new system that you're not getting now? You know, how does it fit in with strategic priorities, that kind of thing? And the second part of the question is there existing software for this type of thing, or do you have to build it? And you know, how are you planning for what data to get out of it and having it as good as it can be?
Great. I'll start with the latter. Yes, there are off-the-shelf options that many other cities are using. And right now, to kind of move things along, Ashley is actually leading an effort for us to have those companies come in and do presentations. So with our IT folks, so they can see what's available and we can see what's available. And what will it do? It's everything from moving work from one staff person to another, so workflow, and tracking that so we can look it up later, 5 years from now, when there's a question about that event or tree. And then also just tree information: what species, where, size, age, health, what work's been done on it, and being able to pull that type of information and report on it, report on those characteristics. So we could say something like, how many Douglas firs do we have and what's their health status? Bing, there it is. We do those things currently, like the street tree inventory, through other tools, but there are systems out there that integrate what we're doing elsewhere right into that workflow and documentation and the analytical capacity. And they're really focused on technical urban forestry needs. So we can do things like specify what equipment are needed for certain tree work, or track permits that were issued around the tree and the work done on the permits. So if you think of how you would imagine folks manage roads and maintain roads or sewer pipes, it's the same thing, but for trees that we're after.
Thanks, Adrian.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, Anjanette? Question?
I think the only thing that was I wanted to talk about, I guess, is that they're going to do the tree inventory again. And just with doing that, is there any like plans of action that's going to be put forward? Cause I just know, like in my neighborhood alone, like a lot of trees, canopy trees have went down, and so like it needs to be like some drastic actions.
Yeah. Thanks, Anjanette. That is the intention of getting that information. There's a saying in urban forestry, probably a lot of other fields too, you can't manage what you don't know. So this will help us see changes like that in your neighborhood. And remember, this is specific to street trees, not other types of trees, parks, private property, what have you. But the idea is we're able to get all that information together with the help of thousands of volunteers and volunteer hours. So there's that connection and tree stewardship aspect that's also hopefully benefiting in partnership opportunities. And then when we have that, we can use the information to illustrate to decision makers what's going on and inform what's needed. Kind of similar to what Jeff Ramsey and Vivek did with City Council about the canopy report. You know, that canopy is declining. This is that step. Let's find out what's going on and then use it. So when we have that, the results of that inventory, it will come to you all. And those are conversations that we will have then about how do we use this information now to get us in the direction we want to go. It will take years, a couple of years to do the inventory because it is a huge project. Is that what you were after, Anjanette, or is there anything else? I saw the nod. Okay.
Yeah, Jen, just a couple of quick questions. I'm trying to keep track of time here too. If we're doing okay, make sure about that. The first is going back to Leah's question about, and I think Bruce's question about, and Melinda's question about data. Metro seems like they would be a really good resource for a lot of the, they have a data resource center, and I don't know how much you've collaborated with them, but they're doing a ton of work. Like I'm thinking about folks like Joe Gordon, who are doing work on kind of canopy distribution. Jeff and I spent a lot of time talking to Joe Gordon when we were tested right before, 3 months meeting weekly, essentially, to try to get our kind of understanding of what's exactly happening with the canopy. And I know Jeff is connected with Joe, and so I just really wondering about if Portland can be a model for so many other municipalities around the region and with the staff that you all have, it can really set a pretty great model for what could be done from a data point of view. And I just wonder the depth and anticipation of that continued collaboration with Metro. That's one question.
Okay, and thank you for saving the second one. Till I answer the first one. Absolutely. And Jeff and others on our team, Jeff Ramsey is the Jeff that Vivek's talking about. Jeff is in our science arm, our two-person science arm of the division, but he maintains regular contact with Metro. That's one of his roles, and working with them is something we'll continue to do in whatever ways opportunities present themselves. What was your next question?
Next one was really, so yeah, I guess it's, yeah, if there's any systematic way to make sure that happens, it becomes opportunistic just with, a council meeting. And so we kind of scrambled to kind of get everything it'd be great, especially given this 2019 LiDAR data, given all the kind of work that Metro's already done. It'd be great to get a little bit of their, I know they're spread thin with all the municipal support they're giving, and Portland's a kind of a big behemoth in the region. And so why do we want to continue giving resources to time to Portland? But nevertheless, I think there is an argument to be made around the model of what Portland can do from a data perspective of trees. It's just it's an area that's just kind of blowing up right now. And it just feels, or growing exponentially right now. It just seems like a lost opportunity to not kind of, if you're feeling a little thin in terms of the analytical depth you have, to kind of lean into Metro a little bit for that as well.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah.
And I think that Metro, when there are layers, right, of data and levels of data, and hopefully everything can roll up together to be useful in the amalgam, collectively. So that's definitely a goal. But I want to say too, yes, Portland seems like the big one that doesn't need help when it comes to Metro. But for a little reality on that, many other cities are very far ahead of Portland when it comes to workflow, data collection, processes, and analytics. What we have has really been done by scrappy staff without the appropriate software, who spend, like Jeff, Angie, others, they spend an immense amount of time pulling things and manually figuring things out so we can report on them and use them to inform policy decisions. So I don't know that Portland is much of a model for others to follow at this point. We are right now pointing at the many other cities who are doing this far better and saying, see, we need that here too, in hopes that that will promote the need.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a quick note, you don't have to do it all in-house. You could often contract that out too. Just as
the analytics, definitely. And we're actively doing that. Vivek himself has been a contractor for us. We have some other contractors working with us. And that is the plan for the Urban Forest Management Plan update, among other things, is to be working with contractors on that.
Great.
It's a great tool. I'm noticing.
Just one last thing I wanted to, I know we're out of time here, but one last thing is just to update on, I'm curious about work that was being done by Portland Parks and Rec for the Sustainable Futures project. There's some other work happening on being able to enable long-term funding options for Portland Parks and Rec. And I'm wondering, I heard from Todd Lofgren about this. And so just curious about how does that, like, where does urban forestry get affected by that? And I think it'd be helpful for commissioners to know kind of the bigger play at work here for funding, longer term funding, as opposed to this levy that we have right now, which is great for filling in some gaps. But really it's a short term thing. So curious if you have any update or anything you want to share about that.
Yes, we can give an update on that. Here's a thought, Vivek. How about I be sure to include that in the report next month because of our time?
Yep.
And then we'll have, I can be more thorough and then have time for questions and discussion.
Great. Yeah, and there'll probably be more information about committee members and things by then, hopefully.
I know, and I know that you've been invited to be a committee member.
Yeah, and I'm mulling that over very seriously, but I'm also may look to other commissioners on this group right here who might also serve in that capacity. So thanks for that. We'll move it to next week or next month.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks for that update. Thanks, commissioners. Looks like we have several folks here and just in time to transition into trees and development overview. Like to welcome Jeff. Hi, good to see you again, Jeff. Long time as well. Bill and Marisol. Welcome all. And I'm excited to kind of also, we have urban forestry staff to help with any of the questions you commissioners may have on this. But I'd like to just maybe turn it over to Brian first to kind of tee us up, and then to get the BPS folks to dig into this. We have a good chunk of time available for this. So this is our main event, if you will, for the June meeting. So Brian, let me hand it over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Vivek. Yes, so this is something that as in the last few months we've been asking commissioners, for items that they'd like to be discussed future meetings, and this is one of them that came up was both to really talk about what are the regulations for trees in development situations, and then also provide a little bit of space for the commission to ask questions of staff following that presentation, then also just have a discussion amongst yourselves. So this is sort of a two-part presentation. So Jeff Cottle and Bill Cunningham are here from the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and they're going to take more of like a Title 33 zoning code look at what are the development types that we typically see in residential areas, what development types are allowed, and you know, how does space for trees factor into those. And then Rick with Urban Forestry, and then Marisol with Bureau of Development Services are going to talk about more on the ground during when a development is happening. What are the regulations that are pertinent to tree preservation, and then the planting requirements as well. So, but yeah, we have about an hour and a half for this, so good chunk of time, and then I'll turn over to Jeff and Bill.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I'll kick us off. Hi, everyone. I am an environmental planner at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and I kind of keep track of the tree code. That's sort of one of my responsibilities. So often I either sit on these Forestry Commission meetings or sometimes present. So it's good to be back. We have a little presentation, as Brian said. What we wanted to start with was really just looking at kind of setting the table a little bit in terms of the zoning code considerations that then lead into the trees and development regulations that are in Title 11. So just going to, and really wanted to highlight a few things. I will put up the presentation here real fast. And we really are looking at, hold on just one sec. Sorry, it's going to the wrong monitor. Just one moment. You can see that now, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just a little bit of agenda. And like I said, really setting the kind of a basis for the specifics to the Title 11 requirements. So really kind of generally development in the zoning code. And then I'll focus on some of the single dwelling residential requirements and highlight some of the residential infill project changes. I will say just before, as a disclaimer, I'm here in sort of in place of Morgan Tracy, who has been managing the residential infill project. So between Bill and myself, we're hoping we'll be able to answer your questions, but in some cases we might need to come back with more clarity, but or more clarifications. But then Bill will talk about multi-dwelling residential and better housing by design, which will open up to some questions. So with that, really just wanted to highlight a few things that really do determine the location and scale of development, specifically residential development in this case. But what we're talking about is front and rear setbacks, and I'll go through each of these in the presentation here. So front and rear setbacks, a key piece is allowable building coverage, and then required outdoor area is you'll see is a relatively small area, but it is a piece of the overall requirements within these residential zones. And then another important aspect that was part of, and I think some of you may have been on the commission when Morgan has presented on residential infill. I think according to him, it's been a little while, but floor area ratio is another key consideration just in terms of how development happens on a residential lot. So just wanted to provide, again, the basics of, and do a little, I think you can see my cursor here. So really the setbacks, we have both front and rear setbacks for all of the residential zones and really for all the zones. Sometimes the setback is 0 in more dense areas, but we do have front and rear setbacks, and then side setbacks as well. And then in some cases for garages, the setbacks may be different than the standard front setback. And that's largely, we have long had in the city of Portland the requirement that the garages can't stick out beyond the front of the structure. So really what we often call snout houses. We've been addressing those for quite some time. So once you have those established setbacks where you can't build, the other key component of the zoning code is building coverage. So on a given lot, and we use percentages for that building coverage. So what percentage of the lot can be developed, what that can be developed area. So in this example that you see here, just shows a typical 5,000 square foot lot, and a 5,000 square foot lot is kind of what we generally think of as a, it's some common, single dwelling lot within the city. So in this case, 45% maximum building coverage, and that's looking at overall lot size as compared to the actual building footprint. As I said, there's also in these residential zones, there is a requirement for outdoor area. They're generally relatively small, but you can see the purpose is to, assure opportunities for outdoor recreation and relaxation. That could take a lot of different forms. It's lawns, pavers, decks. There could be trees in these areas, but it's not to be confused with, there is still the rest of the site, which does not have a structure on it, has to meet Title 11 requirements, which would still incorporate trees. And we'll talk about that. And Rick and Marisol will talk about that. But this is another component. There is a small area that specifically we have mandated there must be at least a minimum amount of outdoor area. So this is a little table. I don't want to get too caught up on the details. This just sort of breaks down. So the single dwelling zones, really what we're focused on for residential infill is the residential 20,000 or R20 to R2.5. That was the focus of the residential infill project I'll talk about in a second. But the key takeaway from this table is simply, as we get to higher density, we go really from low density at the top to higher density at the bottom. And once we then move beyond the central residential, it's really more kind of commercial mixed use type zones. But you see the setbacks, both side and rear, generally get smaller as you go to more what is expected to be more intense development. And then also the max building coverages increase in a similar fashion. The top two lower density R20 and RF zones are a little different in how, because of their large sizes, but you can see that the building coverage increases as we go from top to bottom. So just quickly, a little bit about residential infill. Like I said, I think maybe many of you possibly sat in on presentations from Morgan. But so residential infill specifically was in response to a state mandate to expand housing choice. And that's really focused on single dwelling zones. So they may not technically be single dwelling zones anymore because of these changes. It's really looking to kind of remove the sort of the requirement that only a single dwelling is allowed on an individual lot. And so there's been two phases, which you might be aware of. So the first phase went into effect in August of last year, and the second phase is set to go into effect in July, on July 1st. Again, these are according to state deadlines for meeting these different components of RIP, of residential infill project. So this map shows, so really what we're looking at is all of the single dwelling zones that were in that previous table that I showed you. It's roughly about 150,000 lots. The map you see here are areas that are in what we, that sort of don't, where the full requirements of residential infill are not applicable. It's called we have created an overlay for that area. It's called the Z overlay. And basically those are areas that have been removed as a result of natural resource areas, key natural resource areas, landslide or flood risk, and then also wildfire potential in the lower density zones. So just quickly on the types of housing that are allowed through residential infill, the residential infill project on what had previously been single dwelling zones. You know, there's standard house, ADU. There used to be in the zoning code only an allowance for a duplex in the single family zone on corners. Now you can put a duplex everywhere. Oh, and that's another note related to those parcels in the Z overlay zone. They do have the allowance for duplexes still, but the other types of development that are shown here are limited in the Z overlay. But so you can see there's a large different kind of configurations that are allowed within an individual structure or you know, as a combination of a structure such as duplex plus an ADU in the back or that sort of thing. So there are, for the higher density with sort of triplex, fourplex type situations, there are minimum requirements that need to be met. So both there needs to be a minimum lot size to allow that to occur. And then it has to be on a maintained street. And then again, if they can't be located in the Z overlay. So you see there's affordable sixplex that's identified. That was a decision that was made by City Council to allow for a higher density 6-unit, a sixplex on lots that where the units would be provided for at a specific median family income. So for renters, if 50% of the units, if it's a rental, 50% of the units are for folks that make 60% of the median family income or less, or if it is for sale, then it is 80% of median family income. Again, half of the units have to meet those criteria. So just to note, those particular parcels will continue to be exempt from the preservation standards, but there is a requirement for, and we'll talk about specifics of how lots are kind of building coverage and that sort of thing related to these different situations. But they still have to meet the tree planting, the tree density standards for these sites, and you'll learn more about that in the next presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions related to these as we move into questions. But so just wanted to give a little bit of a feel for the building coverage and what it means on a site. These are the baseline here is a 5,000 square foot lot. Again, that what we traditionally think in Portland is our standard single dwelling lot. So you can see here 30% coverage, which was in the table I had, is basically the max coverage on an R10 lot. You can just sort of get a sense of how much area is still available. And like I said, where trees will be located will depend on it's sort of a combination of if they're incorporated into outdoor area or also just required through the Title 11 requirements for in development situations. So you can see here clearly for the deep affordable, what is called the deep affordability projects, the sixplex, a large portion of the site will be taken with the development. So that is the building coverage allowed through those sixplexes is a 60% building coverage. So there will be clearly some challenges with providing trees in those situations, but still would be expected with tree planting. Just quickly, one of the things, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, but residential infill focused on having more focus on a floor area ratio. So the development type, the scale of development really is more a ratio as compared to the lot size. And these are just some examples of what might be built again in a standard 5,000 square foot lot, and the amount of backyard space that would still be provided with these different building coverages. And so additionally, just looking at kind of the summaries, a little summary of the changes that were part of residential infill and how it relates to tree canopy. One thing that's really important is that we removed the minimum parking requirements. So off-street parking is no longer required in these zones. And that will, if parking is not provided, will allow for fewer curb cuts and less impervious surface on the lot. Residential infill also prioritizes alley access. Again, it allows for that same thing, reduce curb cuts along the street, the frontage street, and more street tree planting opportunities. We talked about floor area ratio. And then largely the overall aim is to increase housing capacity within the same developed area. So all of those building coverages that I reviewed, those are all the same as they were before in the single dwelling zones. And so what we're doing is allowing more intense development basically in the same area, except for those deeper affordability projects, which we talked about, which will likely, that is a higher building coverage than we have normally allowed in those areas. So with that, I think I will pass it over to Bill to talk about kind of our multi-dwelling zones. Bill? I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff was mentioning, we're focusing today on our zones where most of our residential development takes place. And I'm going to provide some information about how our multi-dwelling zones work. And not just talking about things specific to trees, but things related to requirements for outdoor space that provide more space for trees. I'm going to launch into the presentation. One thing to bear in mind is, as you saw in the yellow in that previous map that Jeff had shared, a whole lot of the city has single dwelling zoning. And what this map is showing is the multi-dwelling zoning in blue, and then the mixed use commercial zoning in red. Together, they're about 15% of the city's land area. The multi-dwelling zones are 8%. And where those zones are typically located are in some of our urban center type locations like the Northwest District. Pretty much all that residential area is multi-dwelling zoning. But then along our corridors like Southeast 122nd, we have a fair amount of multi-dwelling zoning, sometimes extending up to a quarter mile off of the corridor. And there's a question about whether white is single dwelling. I'd say in the non-industrial areas, it's largely single dwelling or open space, but up by the Portland International Airport and by Highway 30, those white areas are typically industrial. But yep, in terms of the more habited parts of the city, much of what you see here that's white is single dwelling, with the multi-dwelling and mixed use being on the corridors and in our mixed use centers. Next slide, please. One thing I wanted to mention is just many people aren't aware of the newer regulations for our multi-dwelling zones. They became effective a couple of years ago. And I just wanted to highlight some of those so people understand the way the regulations in our multi-dwelling zones work. One thing we did was to increase requirements for outdoor space and courtyards. There's greater limitations on surface parking lots and on front vehicle areas. There are new requirements for landscape front setbacks. And I'm going to talk too about some new provisions for transferring development rights in exchange for tree preservation. But I'll get into that in more detail. Next, please. Just provide some context, and this may also answer questions you might have about the way multi-dwelling developments happened. Is a greater number of our multi-dwelling zone sites are larger sites, especially in East Portland. And very typically, we had been receiving development like what you see here. And this is also useful for understanding some of the shortcomings of just looking at building coverage or landscaping requirements, because these developments here probably have less than 50% building coverage on the site. But you can see that the bits that are left over, the setbacks where trees are required, are pretty small. It's the leftover spaces between the buildings and the property lines, leftover spaces between the buildings themselves, or parking lot landscaping. So one thing we're really trying to address was, how do we provide or address the quality and configuration of those open spaces so you have more useful space for people and for trees. And just one thing I wanted to mention too in the slide before we move on is we had actually partnered with PSU and Vivek in understanding way urban heat island impacts work, and definitely came to understanding of how blacktop, dark surfaces or asphalt really are a major contributors towards greater heat in a lot of these developments. And one thing we did was to limit the percentage of site area that could be vehicle area to no more than 30%, so less than a third. In some cases nowadays, we had seen things that were nearly half of the site. Sometimes it'd be half of the site is building, half the site is parking, and then landscaping is the little remnants. So no more than 30%. And we also limited asphalt or blacktop to more than 15% of total site area. So in the future, there'll be less of the asphalt intensive development. Next, please. Just to, in a way, correspond to what was shared for the single dwelling zones, wanted to highlight building coverage in the multi-dwelling zones. Our most common multi-dwelling zone is the smaller scale zone, the RM1, and it's a similar maximum building coverage to the single dwelling zones. It's 50%. And one thing that's a bit different in our multi-dwelling zones is that there are landscaping requirements. In the RM1, it's a 30% minimum landscaping. Typically L1 landscaping standards, which come along with them, are requirements for trees. And there's a little bit of an interplay between the zoning code landscaping standards for trees and Title 11. RM2 is the next bigger zone, 60% building coverage and 20% landscaping. And that's showing a somewhat larger site with that configuration. And one thing to highlight is those low to medium scale zones are 90% of our multi-dwelling zoning. The biggest scale zones, which we especially have in places like the Northwest District and Kings Hill, Gateway, they allow up to 85% building coverage and just have 15% landscaping. One thing that changes the dynamics a bit is we have a newer requirement that for large sites, more than 20,000 square feet, that at least 10% of the site needs to be devoted to common area. I just, it sounds like a small percentage, but I wanted to, on the next slide, share a little bit about what that means. 10%, not a lot, but when it's in one space on a site, it tends to amount to more than the percentage might suggest itself. We did a fair amount of analysis of historic courtyard apartment buildings, which a lot of people liked as a housing type, as well as newer ones that are centered around courtyards. And both the images I'm shown here have approximately 10% of the site area in common area. But again, it's a contiguous common area that really it makes for more usable space for people and trees. And one thing to bear in mind too is until recently, we didn't require any residential outdoor space for our higher density zones or our mixed use zones. But now there is a requirement, it's generally like 50 square feet per unit. You could do it either in form of individual spaces or combined into a common area. So the way the formula works now is the more units you have, the more outdoor space you need to find. And common area is one way to meet that requirement. Next slide, please. A few other things that play into the whole tree equation and the multi-dwelling zones is until a couple years ago, we had almost no limitations in front vehicle areas, especially for things like attached houses, such as in the upper left image. And you can see what resulted from that is very little opportunity for street trees. We have much stricter requirements now for front parking and driveways, which preserves a lot more space along the planting strips for street trees. Similarly to the single dwelling zones, we don't require parking in most situations. So there's more of an option to not have to have a site area devoted to vehicle areas. Also, in most of our zones now, there is a requirement for a bit of a setback, and that's both to out of consideration for privacy and livability for the residents in these residential zones. And it also provides a bit more space for canopy for street trees or for trees within the setbacks. So that's something to be aware of. That's changing the way things happen. Next, please. We have a few provisions that are unique to East Portland. We really wanted to be mindful of some of the issues in East Portland. And one issue being related to trees, that a lot of people in East Portland very much like that the Douglas firs are a key part of the character and skyline of East Portland. And as you can see from the image on the left, and those are Douglas firs, very often they're not in the form of street trees. In fact, they often don't have sidewalks with planting strips for trees. They're very often mid-block trees that are spanning multiple properties. And there was interest amongst the community about keeping more of that mid-block area greener and less built up. A lot of people liked some of the examples we have of urban districts in places like Europe, where there's often a fair amount of density, but it's along the street front edge with the middle of the block kept more open. And that played a role in our regulations. And next slide, please. So the way multi-dwelling zone development had typically been happening in East Portland was similar to what you see on the left, where basically they're covering most of the site with buildings. The outdoor space that remains is not very substantial. And there's now a requirement for East Portland. And the thing to be aware of in East Portland is the sites are a lot deeper, typically in the inner neighborhoods. They're often 150, sometimes 200 feet deep. And there's now a requirement that you need to set aside that rear setback, 25% of the depth of the site, as primarily outdoor space. There are also options that if you do a large chunk of green elsewhere in the site, say for a large central courtyard, or if you wanted to preserve trees somewhere in the site, you can meet that requirement elsewhere. And again, it's all part of that idea of looking not just about the amount of space that's not built on, but the quality and configuration of that space, so that is a more usable space. And one thing I should highlight too, and why we focus this on the multi-dwelling zones, is there is more flexibility for doing these kinds of things on those larger sites that are more common in the multi-dwelling zones. Next, please. I just wanted to say a little bit about a new sort of provision that we introduced into the code. We have an allowance where, in exchange for preserving large trees on a site, you could transfer your development rights from the site that's preserving the trees to other locations. And it's based on the size of the trees being preserved and the numbers of trees being preserved. And there are requirements for things like covenants for both the giving and receiving site that regulate the future intensity and the tree preservation on those sites. Next, please. And just to give you some sense for how it works, is the image on this slide on the left shows what we call our base floor area ratio development allowances, just basically how much development you could do on the site. And in our most common zone, you could do a 2-story building covering half the lot, and that's your maximum development allowance. And the way tree preservation works is if you set aside site area for trees, kind of like the middle image, but perhaps you're not able to build as much on that site as a result of setting aside the site area, or maybe you're just preserving what the building is already there. And rather than just losing that development opportunity, you can sell or transfer the development allowances that you deferred by preserving trees to another site. So the receiving site could go bigger as a result of the transfer of development rights. you can't cover any more of the lot on the receiving site. So there's still the same amount of land reserved for open space, but you can typically go taller. And one thing to highlight with this, it's a totally new kind of provision. We've had transfer of development rights for historic resources, where if you're preserving an historic smaller scale building, you could transfer the unused allowances elsewhere. And we're basically applying the same allowance to tree preservation. And this is one that's tricky in that we don't have a really great matchmaking approach where connecting people who want to sell development rights or preserve the trees on their site and those who want to receive it to get greater scale. So that's something I think working with community partners or within the city, we could do more of. And just to highlight an opportunity for this, I was in a seminar with King County, and they have a very developed tree preservation transfer development rights program where the county purchases development rights to preserve trees, and then they sell it to developers who want greater scale. So the developers who want to go bigger know where to find it. They just go to the county and purchase those development rights, and that it ends up being a self-sustaining, and they turn that money over again to purchase those development rights and other properties. So again, one reason we're doing this was seeing how we could find new tools to preserve trees in places like East Portland, where those existing trees are so much a part of the urban forest. I just want to thank people like Vivek and Jen Cairo who were involved in crafting some of these regulations, but it's still all new. We don't know for sure how it's all going to work, and future monitoring will be important. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks so much, Bill. Can we open it up? Are you comfortable with commissioners going around asking a set of questions or comments?
Sure.
Okay, great. Can we, any commissioners want to start, and then we can just go around? Anything pressing your, yeah, maybe not pressing your buttons on this, but maybe pressing your interest on terms of the residential infill and the way tree preservation works? Any clarifications, questions? Maybe open the floor and then we'll just go around. Yeah, Bruce, you want to start us off?
This is a question that came up at a hearings officer in his decision on a space being allowed for a heritage tree overlooking Swan Island. The lawyer for the property owners raised the issue of if further restrictions were put on the land required for this heritage tree, that would remove a little space for housing. And under the state's mandate or whatever to provide more space for housing, that might be deemed illegal. And so that influenced the hearings officer's decision. There were other things at play, but what I wondered is, now these homes are going to be selling for, I'm guessing, $800,000 to over $1 million. And yet there was concern for providing land for that kind of housing. And my understanding of RIP was we're trying to provide space for middle housing. And then in the various code, we have language to provide incentives to builders to so they can build more affordable housing. But I was not aware that we're also in the business of providing space for very expensive housing. So I just wondered, the lawyer might have just raised it as kind of a scare tactic. I don't know, but I'm just throwing it out. All this concern about housing, is it really focused?
let's see, Jeff, I don't know if you can answer that one. I'm not so familiar with the way the state statutes work. I know typically in Oregon, there are requirements for kind of clear and objective tracks for housing to happen. And it's not especially nuanced as to whether that housing allowed by the zoning is expensive housing or not expensive housing, but typically there are state safeguards ensuring some predictability that you could produce the housing that zoning allows. But not an expert in the state dimensions. Jeff, any thoughts on that one?
I mean, I guess I would think that that was not necessarily, I'd have to know more details about the specifics of the proposal. I mean, one thing that we are always, cognizant of is how the regulations limit or severely limit is really the critical piece, development on a site. And so, it's a little nebulous, but there is a certain threshold where you have the whole kind of take question. But in this case, it's hard to know if it was specifically related to a heritage tree. I think seems like maybe a unique situation. I can't really speak too much to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Jen, you want to respond to that?
Don't actually, I had a question for Jeff and Bill.
Okay. And then maybe we'll follow up to Melinda and go down the route. All right, go ahead, Jen.
I appreciated, Bill, you wrapping up kind of about monitoring to see what the outcomes of the policies are. Is there anything you can share on the plans and roles for monitoring at this time?
I am not sure. I've heard conversation about, seeing what results from a RIP. I have not heard any like a staffing allocation for monitoring what results from like those Better Housing by Design amendments. But Jeff, do you know anything more about any commitment to follow up?
Yeah, and I don't know much about how it's a long-term commitment or what the situation is of someone specifically dedicated to it, but I do know, even in working with Morgan, they are monitoring. So for example, he gave me updated information on how many units in given lots have been developed per RIP, and kind of that whole question of like that we're getting more units in sort of smaller developed area, kind of that analysis. I do know that also we have someone who gives us, occasionally he has given us updates on the number of triplexes and fourplexes and that sort of thing that have been developed through residential infill. In terms of the piece of potential impact on trees and that sort of thing, I don't think they're doing that, but I do think they're monitoring, just looking at how frequent these paths are taken, how many of these kind of more intense development, especially triplex and fourplex, are happening. So I think we do have that data. I think if we wanted to expand it, that's a different question in terms of what other implications that has. Yeah.
Thank you both.
I don't have any questions.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation.
Welcome.
Leah?
I had a couple questions. One, I feel like I should know the answer to this one. It's more for Jen. What's the minimum setback for what we would call a large form tree? Like how much space do we need to fit a large form tree on? Yeah.
Rick Faber is in the room. Rick, could you respond to that, please?
So there's actually a code-defined calculation to determine a large form tree. It's based on the size at maturity, the rate of growth, and the something else. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of it today. So there is a calculation that's in Title 11 that defines a small, medium, or large form tree, and that's what we use to define those.
The expected canopy coverage, is that the other one? It's okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
I'm wondering, just because I saw that, the 10-foot setback, and I know in our code, you can also remove a tree if it's within 10 feet of a structure. So I'm just trying to imagine how, like what kind of size tree could realistically fit in that space. And my other wondering was, the parking. I think I'm so glad that we're getting rid of the minimum parking, but we also, thinking about East Portland, it can be a really dangerous place to be a pedestrian, a cyclist. A lot of traffic fatalities are happening in East Portland. So this is where I think about, like, holistically, are we also working on our public transit? Are we also working on safer streets to help people get where they need to go when they don't have parking access in their, like, multi-unit housing? So that's the other thing that's on my mind, is just thinking holistically. Like, I'm all for less pavement 100%, but we have to think about, what are we doing to make sure people can actually get to work safely if they don't have access to parking?
And that's a great question. I work in convening a multi-bureau group that's focused on improving outcomes in East Portland. And there are definitely a number of projects happening. PBOT has been working on improving the pedestrian environment, especially in the big corridors, and adding additional safer signalized pedestrian crossings. They have a current plan for 122nd, of course, with 82nd Avenue switching over from the state to the city. A lot of planning efforts related to that. But PBOT's had a number of efforts focusing on those most dangerous streets where the conflicts are. Again, 122nd and Stark. I've been working on one in Park Rose on Sandy Boulevard. So there's a lot of work focused on that, and Parks is of course working on parks improvements, Mill Park and some other ones. But it's not an easy one, especially making sure that our mixed-use centers truly become local hubs where people can walk to services. That's something the city doesn't control everything that's happening, but very mindful of the fact that we need holistic approaches to making things work and making it possible to walk and take transit. And TriMet's been part of our conversations too. We have a new improved bus service north-south and some of our big arterials. There's going to be a shuttle service coming in, connecting from the Park Rose light rail station to employment or industrial jobs in the Columbia corridor. So yeah, there's a lot happening, and it's certainly not all in the zoning code. It's all those other pieces.
That's great. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Bill. Adrian, I think we're next.
Yeah, I was interested, I don't know if it's even possible to answer the bigger question that I have, but the smaller first is that it sounds like there's been some thought about mitigation on the infill build around, parking and other green space. And I was wondering about the timing. Is that all new ruling, to try to mitigate some of the, maybe loss of green space with infill build? But I think the larger question is, has there been sort of any modeling done around, kind of parcels available for development or likely, and how the new infill build rules may contribute to reduction in canopy or loss of opportunity to increase canopy? I mean, as the commissioners, we're very concerned about the infill build and its impact on green space. So, wondering what's been done on this and what's going to be done.
I know a little bit about this, but Jeff, feel free to chime in. But as part of the residential infill project, especially for the first phase, there was a lot of economic analysis looking at how looking at the values of properties and the likelihood of properties developing under different scenarios. There's a lot of analysis about that. And one thing the analysis is showing is that one thing that had been happening a fair amount in our single dwelling zones is that people were taking these very small cottages, knocking them down and building much bigger, 3,000 square foot plus houses that covered a lot more of the lot. And one thing RIP did, there's been a lot of focus on the allowances for duplexes and triplexes, but it tamped down on the scale allowed for those houses. So you won't be able to go as big as before. I think something like less than I think it's about 2,500 square foot max. So it changes the development economics. You won't be able to build the super big house, and that, at least the economic analysis I was showing, was reducing likelihood in many cases for knocking down the smaller house because you can't go quite so big anymore. There was some expansion of allowances because of the additional units. And there's certain parts of town where I think there's seen as a greater likelihood of redevelopment happening, especially in what some call the middle band areas, like Montevilla, Brentwood, Darlington areas. But I think overall, the rate of demolition, at least from what I saw, was predicted to, because of the reduction in the house size, and to go down, while the overall housing production, because you can get more units within that space, would go up. It's a little bit confusing, but yeah, I think bottom line is fewer big, super expensive type houses because of the limitations, but more triplexes.
Well, and I think in terms of just your general question, I can check with Morgan to see what may have been done. I'm not sure whether an assessment of potential tree canopy impacts was done. Again, this is largely, at least we started the project, I think, residential infill sort of in our own way, and then state mandate came down. And so, so I can see if anything was done and follow up on that. I think the other opportunity, especially just in sort of coordination and collaboration with BPS, is when we start moving, especially with the most recent tree canopy report that Parks put together, and the recognition that there is a reduction in canopy that we're seeing, and thinking about once we move into the urban forest management plan update, sort of doing that sort of upfront. We are in the process of updating our economic opportunities analysis in terms of and that tells us where we think development is likely to happen throughout the city, largely focused on commercial areas, but might be useful for that. So we could think about, I think that's an opportunity to sort of set sort of baselining where we are and what the expectations are in the future as a result of the different, I think the combination, sort of what Jen's talking about, maybe the sort of assessment of what we know so far, and trying to determine some assumptions about what development we would see in the future and how that informs the urban forestry management plan.
Great, thank you.
From what I saw in the presentation, it appears that the developments would be done, and then new small trees would be planted. And I just wanted to know if there was any plan to preserve the current canopy, because that's something you can't just plant. And we'll lose a whole generation of folks with a canopy if we don't have a plan for our canopy, especially the fact that you said that in East Portland, which is a heavy impact area, is not street trees, which seems to be getting most attention currently. So the issue is that those trees are being cut down, and we're getting these little puny sticks with leaves on them planted, and those are also dying. It doesn't seem to be that they're being upkept. And so I think that there needs to be like a serious plan that I hear that says this is the plan to maintain the canopy in East Portland. And also, here's how we're going to keep the trees alive that are required to be planted. Here is the mandatory statutes that you need to uphold, because the tree canopy that was cut down right here close to my house, about 12, 13 trees were cut down. Apartments were built, and they have the green space, and they have a lot of little puny trees, and about at least 10% of them are dying, and that's just within the first 2 years. So over time, a couple of those trees might survive, but I don't have high hopes because I don't see a lot of maintenance.
Thanks, Anjanette. Yeah. Any thoughts, responses, reactions? Phil, Jeff?
I'll defer to probably Jeff or someone who knows the way, like Title 11 tree planting requirements and maintenance over time works. I can't answer that one so much, but those are great questions because Anjanette is correct that we're much more dependent on the trees on private property in East Portland than the inner neighborhoods. So probably a solution for the future of the urban forest in East Portland is it's going to have to be multifaceted, looking at what is the role of future street trees, what is the role of those existing fir groves and new trees and making sure they survive. I don't have a clear answer. We're hoping that some of our new requirements for outdoor space and multi-dwelling zones and the transfer of development rights for preserving the trees could have an impact, but it's probably going to require a more holistic approach and a more public approach to move forward with those kinds of things. Most developers I've talked to have never heard of the transfer of development rights to preserve those trees, and we don't have a clear matchmaking service to transfer those rights. But yeah, I defer to other people in terms of the ongoing maintenance of those trees newly planted.
Looks like Brian was going to say something. Yeah, go ahead, Marcel, because I was going to say, I think it may be covered in the next.
Yeah, some of that will
Yeah.
certainly be covered, and I can go into more detail as we get into that presentation. Title 11 definitely has overall requirements for preservation, and it may be better to answer towards the end, but some of the incentives would be the high fees for removing larger removing larger trees. And then as far as planting, the zoning code does have requirements for maintaining plantings. There's not a circle back process. It becomes more of a compliance issue. And that somewhat complicates it, in that once the final inspection occurs on the permit, property owners are obligated to maintain their landscaping, but there's not a check 2 years later, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. And yeah, I was going to say, if there aren't any other more questions, this might be a good time to move into the next presentation, just so we have time for it.
Yeah, Bruce, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted, Jeff, a question I have is, I have heard that with the passage of RIP 1 and RIP 2, residential zones are essentially meaningless. Is that an inaccurate statement?
I'll also let Bill chime in if I get this wrong, but I mean, I think maybe you could argue that single dwelling zones are no longer, there is no such thing anymore, because all of those zones that I identified allow, even in the Z overlay, which again, thanks Vivek for, I didn't mention, the purple was where the areas that have the Z overlay, and it was in the chat, hopefully everyone saw that, but even in the Z overlay, which you can't do anything else more intensely in any more intense development, you can still do a duplex in those areas. So to a certain degree, what we have known as single dwelling zones are no longer as a result of the state mandate. Yeah.
Yep. Probably the more accurate term now is small scale residential, because those are still the smaller scale zones where typically you can't cover more than 45 to 50% of the lot. And the height is still about the same, 30 feet. But instead of the big house, it might be a duplex or triplex. So it's small scale residential. You won't be seeing 4-story mixed use buildings on those sites. So if that's useful.
Thank you.
All right. And do I understand right, Marisol, you have additional material you're gonna provide us?
Yeah, so I will jump in. I'll share my screen with a joint presentation that Marisol and I will present, focusing on Title 11 regulations. We were just getting the high aerial view. Now we're going to get down to the wheels on the ground about how we're going to review plans and the rules in play. So I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. I was supposed to, there we go. Okay. So, right, so we had our high level view. We're now going to come down a little bit into Title 11 and talk about how trees are regulated in these development situations. This presentation is modified based off of a presentation we gave earlier to a home builders association. So the initial target audience was home builders themselves. We're going to do a quick overview of the Title 11 and tree regulations in general. We're going to focus on the on-site trees and then the street tree regulations. Tree conscious design is actually cut out of today's just to limit the time, but we will hopefully have time for some questions to really focus in at the end. Title 11 was implemented in 2015, so we're going on 5, 6, 7 years now. Its intended goal was to consolidate a lot of city tree regulations. It took things from different titles and put them all into one place. It covers both development and non-development. And one of its primary goals was to set a tree preservation baseline in development so that anybody that's developing a lot has an understanding right at the beginning what they're going to be expected to do. Prior to Title 11, there was a lot of confusion because it wasn't quite clear which code would come into play and how it would be, how it would impact the development. Since it has only been around for 7 years, we are doing regular updates. There is a pretty significant project going on led by Brian and Nick Desai that's going to make a couple more updates coming up soon. For development in general, we're looking for a tree plan. You have to make sure the trees are on the plan. If you don't have the trees on the plan, you can't handle them during development. We don't know what's going on. There's going to be that baseline tree preservation, as I mentioned. It's going to require street tree planting based on a project valuation. So even if you're not impacting the right of way, if you're making site improvements that are $25,000 or greater, we're going to be looking for those street trees to be planted. It's one of the few ways that we have to get new street trees to be required to be planted. There's going to be on-site planting, has a requirement at the non-conforming threshold, currently $330,000, so it's much higher for the on-site planting. There are requirements for arborist reports for when the project is trying to work around trees or make exceptions to the standard rules. And there's requirements for tree preservation inspections for when trees are being preserved, and there are requirements, and we're going to actually have an inspector go out there and make sure that any kind of preservation methods are in place. Title 11 is split up into both the Bureau of Development Services and Portland Parks and Recreation primarily. I'll start off with Portland Parks and Recreation. For on-site private trees, the tree inspectors are doing preservation inspections. For street trees, tree inspectors and tree technicians are doing a preservation review to see what trees we can save, planting review to see when we have places to plant trees, and we are doing planting inspections for public works permits. So for public works permits, we actually will go out there and make sure the trees are planted correctly in the right location, right species, everything. For city trees, again, that's all Portland Parks and Recreation. We're reviewing the preservation, the planting, and we're doing any kinds of inspections as necessary. And then for heritage trees, lots of talk about heritage trees. Anytime they come up around development, we are getting our eyes on them to make sure that they're adequately preserved. And with that, I'm going to toss over to Marisol to talk about the Bureau of Development Services.
Great, thanks, Rick. So Bureau of Development Services, specifically land use services, and my team, planning and zoning, does the permit review of majority of permits that come through. The Title 11 part of our review is focused on on-site private trees. We're regularly looking at tree preservation, planting requirements, and then BDS does planting inspections when there are 5 trees or more. We also implement Title 33, and that has a variety of tree and landscape standards throughout the codes that are more development specific. So parking lots have specific landscaping and tree requirements. Other development types have screening requirements, and then we have environmental zones and greenway type regulations. Next slide, please. Within Title 11, again, it's the trees and development situations. There are 2 primary chapters that we are reviewing for that apply to the on-site in development situations. Chapter 1150 regulates the preservation, protection, and removal of existing trees, and also the planting of new trees, which is tree density. The standards encourage incorporating existing trees into site design, and there is an emphasis on retaining and protecting existing large trees. Chapter 1160 contains the detailed specifications for preserving and planting trees. There's tree protection methods that are described in detail. There's a prescriptive path, which is a code standard path. And then there is a performance path, which incorporates an arborist developing a specific plan that might deviate from the required prescriptive path, either distances or methods for providing protection. And then finally, there are specifications for tree planting. So to go back to one of the questions that was asked, Title 11 does provide specific requirements for planting, minimum planting dimensions that is dependent on the size category of a tree planted. So for example, a large category tree would require a minimum 150 square foot area with minimum dimensions of 10 feet by 10 feet. That's an example. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the overall tree preservation requirements. The tree preservation standards apply to sites that are 5,000 square feet or larger in area when there's ground disturbance that impacts root protection zone of any non-exempt tree 12 inches or larger in diameter. There are some exemptions, sites that have a high building coverage, 85% or greater, dead, dying, dangerous, nuisance species trees. They have to be documented by an arborist in a tree plan. So an applicant couldn't just label everything a dead tree or a nuisance species. Specific zones, now it is reduced down to just the heavy industrial zone. So portions of sites that have that designation are exempt. And then, for example, land divisions, Title 33 does have specific tree preservation requirements built into regulations. So in some cases where there is a tree preservation plan that was developed through a land use review, the properties are subject to that plan. The overall requirement is to either preserve existing trees or mitigate if they're removed. The requirement is 1/3 of non-exempt trees, 12 inches and larger in diameter, and all non-exempt trees 20 inches and larger in diameter, subject to the preservation requirements. Next slide, please. Where someone is not preserving the trees on site, the mitigation option is a payment in lieu of tree preservation. It is required for any tree that's 20 inches or larger that's not preserved, and it's required for any combination of trees below the 1/3 requirement that are not preserved. And the fee is based on the size of the tree. There's a standard fee for trees that are between 12 and 20 inches of $1,800. And at 20 inches, the larger trees have a much more significant fee at a per inch, $450, and that does add up quickly and seems to provide some incentive for preserving those larger trees. Next slide, please. Oh, and sorry, just one thing that you may know this, but the mitigation fee goes into a tree planting and preservation fund so that urban forestry can replace that canopy elsewhere. So we have just a few examples of how tree preservation could play out on, this is a standard 5,000 square foot lot with a generic house plan on it. In a situation where there may be 3 existing trees of various sizes, an applicant would be required to provide an actual tree preservation plan to demonstrate how they're preserving the trees. But in terms of the overall numbers, the situation that you see here, there are 3 trees on site. 1 tree is being removed, 2 are being preserved, including the larger over 20-inch tree. And this would meet the preservation standard with no mitigation required. Next slide, please. In the next example, all the trees are under 20 inches. The applicant could propose to remove all of the trees. Mitigation would be required for 1/3 of the trees, and that would be a flat fee based on the size of the tree. Next slide, please. And then final example, this is a situation where there's a larger tree on the site. An applicant in this situation, if they were removing the larger tree, would be paying the per inch fee for that tree, which at that size would equate to about $17,000. They would also be required to do a public notification and posting for the code requirement to do that for larger trees over 36 inches in diameter. Next slide, please. Then we get into our other commonly applied standard, which is tree planting or tree density. Tree density is required with new development and for any development, larger projects typically that are above the non-conforming upgrade threshold in the zoning code. That is a number that changes annually with the construction cost index, currently 330,800. So we're primarily seeing it with new development. There are some exemptions. They're more industrial and agricultural related and heavy industrial zone. Next slide, please. The on-site tree planting requirement is based on the size of the site and the type of development being proposed. Over to the right, you can see the table that is straight out of Title 11. It breaks it down by 1 and 2 family development, multifamily development, and then gives a percentage of site that is required to be planted with tree canopy. The trees are designated with a specific square footage based on the size of the canopy. So large trees, for example, are allocated at 1 tree per 1,000 square feet. And you can see that at the left. Medium and small trees have a 500 and 300 square foot allocation respectively. There's credit given for preserving existing trees that essentially are in increments based on the size of the tree. So trees that are 6 inches and more in diameter are credited at a medium-sized tree at 500 square feet per full 6-inch increment. Smaller trees than 6 inches also can be preserved on site and counted towards the density requirements. And the smaller trees are given a 300 square foot allocation. Next slide, please. And then finally, we just have some examples of options that people have with the planting of trees. This is again back to the typical 5,000 square foot lot, a single dwelling zone development. The 40% requirement would give a requirement of 2,000 square feet of tree area. This could be met with a combination of options, and we'll go through a couple of those. In this particular option, preserving the large 18-inch tree would give them a 1,500 square foot credit, and then any combination of trees from there could be combined to make the overall 2,000 square foot limitation, requirement. Next slide, please. And this one is showing 2 large trees that could be used to meet the requirement. Note that using large trees essentially will take up less landscaping area and can be an incentive to plant the larger ones if there is space for that. Next slide, please. And then finally, again, 2 medium trees and 1 large tree would also meet the standard. So there were quite a few options for choosing how to allocate the trees and distribute them on site. And next slide, please. Turns it over to Rick.
So Marisol talked about the on-site trees and the on-site preservation, on-site planting. We're going to move out into the right-of-way, which is where urban forestry is involved. So for street tree preservation requirement, it's required whenever there's going to be ground disturbance and there are existing street trees that are 3 or more inches in diameter. Has the same level of exemptions as the on-site with the dead, dying, dangerous, and nuisance species trees, or if there's anything in Title 33 land use decision that overrides the preservation. And the big difference between street tree preservation and the on-site tree preservation is on-site, it's a very much a numbers game with the 1/3 trees based on the size of the tree. With the street, it's based on an urban forestry review, considering the impacts and opportunities to retain these trees. So anytime there is a street tree being proposed for removal and development, an urban forestry tree inspector actually goes out there and looks at the tree or trees and determines whether they meet the exemptions and whether or not preservation is feasible. And so we work closely with all of the other infrastructure bureaus to try to work around the existing trees wherever possible, moving driveways, moving water lines, having buildings set back farther, sometimes an option to preserve trees. We do look for additional technical analysis on occasion when the applicant is determined that the tree has to be removed. We require them to prove to us that it's necessary. That it's different on every case. Unfortunately, there's no real set standard because every tree is different, every site is different. But we're looking for an adequate analysis indicating that the tree has to be removed to allow the development to move forward without undue cost. Any trees that are approved for removal require mitigation of up to 2 trees. So that's also a big difference. With the on-site trees, we have the 20-inch trees that have the inch per inch mitigation requirement. A street tree is capped at 2 trees for mitigation. And part of that is to acknowledge the challenges of preserving the trees in the development situations and that they will be preserved if they can be. For preservation, yes, for preservation, we do have standardized protection methods now. This picture here showing, we're putting up a fence around the soil to help protect the tree wherever possible. Again, working with the trees in the right-of-way, we're also dealing with some of the construction materials. Oftentimes cranes need additional pruning that we might not have allowed otherwise for the trees. Each one of those cases is reviewed individually by the tree inspectors. The street tree planting requirement is triggered at a very low valuation of $25,000 or greater. And the goal is to plant 1 tree for every 25 linear feet with lots of exemptions. If there's existing utilities or the planting area is less than 3 feet wide, we're not going to be planting a tree where they can't fit. So We have our tree technicians and our tree inspectors reviewing the frontages for the projects and finding room for these trees, working with the other utility bureaus to determine what can be moved around to find locations for them. Anytime a tree cannot be planted due to new infrastructure, so if you're building a new building, it never had a driveway before, they're installing a driveway, we're losing a planting space, there's going to be a fee in lieu of planting for that lost tree. Whereas if there was an existing driveway, then that would be an exemption. The street tree planting requirement can be very simple. This is a 79-foot frontage. It's got some existing driveways and water services. Because of the driveway, only 2 trees were required. They were able to place 2 trees, so there's no mitigation required. It gets more complicated though. In this one, I have it as an example. There's a new water line. You can see there as 8. You've got a new light labeled there as 9. Because the frontage is 50 feet or more, they have 1 tree. The new utilities are preventing the planting of a second tree, so a fee would be required in lieu of planting that second tree. And so that comes to the end of the talk. We've got some contact information here for both planning and zoning, for urban forestry. We have our websites and our emails. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody and take any questions.
Right. Thank you, Marisol and Rick. Lots of details there. Where do we want to start? Okay, Bruce, let's jump in.
When you're for new development, can you place your building in such a way that all of the trees are in the footprint of the building and therefore they wouldn't be considered part of the picture?
Under the on-site development standards, there isn't an out for trees within 10 feet of the building, if that's what you're referring to. An applicant would need to account for those trees. So they would still be completely subject to the overall tree preservation requirements, and they would need to either site the house or development such that they were able to preserve some of them, or they would be subject to the mitigation fee if none of the trees could be preserved to meet the requirement.
And that would apply for ADU construction also?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
any development essentially will trigger that.
Okay.
Hey, Tran.
Yeah, my question was about, the whole concept of paying, or I guess in a sense, fine for removing a tree in development situations. And to the degree, I'm wondering, to what degree are those replaced somewhere, or do we even know? And, have any studies been done about this either in Portland or elsewhere? I know it's kind of a complicated question, but.
So the question was, where are the trees being replanted with the funds that come in?
Exactly. Yeah. And do we accomplish a 1-for-1? And
yeah.
Yeah.
I think Jen's going to be able to jump in on this one better with the planting program. Thanks, Jen.
Right. Yes, which we could also spend time on at some point, but that tree, that tree fund is one of the 2 funds that you all hear about each year and is reported to council in the Title 11 Trust Funds report. And that is the sole dedicated money that's available to urban forestry for all the planting that needs to be done in the city. Reminder, there are about 90,000 vacant street tree spaces, and we max out at around 4,000 trees planted a year. And how we use that is according to the city's tree planting strategy, which is called Growing a More Equitable Forest. Hopefully that rings some bells for you all, and maybe we can put that link in the chat, which was created with the help of many, including 7 different community groups. It was completed in 2018. And Adrian, it focuses on spending what resources we have in the priority areas for planting, which are low canopy, low income, and primarily community of color areas of the city. And we have maps that we update regularly using census data and our own canopy data and others data to update and see where our focus should be going forward. In the past, and you'll see this in research nationwide, when it's been a more putting trees back where they came out, or an opt-in type model, hey, we have trees, come sign up, that pattern of inequity has been perpetuated. And that's why we've taken this different approach. And that includes how we do the free street tree planting, which is an opt-out rather than an opt-in.
Thank you. Wait, check in with Leah, check in with Melinda. Looks like Anjanette's not here. But Leah, Melinda, any thoughts, reactions, questions for Rick and Marisol?
No, actually, Jen just covered my one question. So
Okay.
where they're replanting. Yeah.
Could I mention also, in case it's not real clear, remember that fund is because trees were lost, existing trees. And as Anjanette so eloquently put before, keeping what we have that's big is absolutely the place we want to be before we go towards planting. Planting is not a one-for-one with that. So when we say that fund is for planting new trees, it's really for trying to get back some portion of the canopy that's been lost.
Hey, Leah.
No questions, just kind of touching back on it's really great that we have in our code, the need to maintain trees and some of these things that are meant to keep trees, but also the question about enforcement and how we know that people are actually following the code or making sure. And I know it's been a huge challenge in the past just because of the lack of staffing and the capacity. And I'm hoping with some of the new funding, but again, recognizing that it's shorter term and it's hard to hire long-term folks with that money. But yeah, just keeping that in our minds that it's great that it's in the code, but if it's not enforced, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good. So how thinking about that too.
Great. I have a few things that I'm just curious about. It kind of brought up with both the presentations. I'm a little bit, well, I guess I'll start broad. I'm curious about the urban forest management plan that we've talked about as a commission, and that the potential is there for us to move, or for urban forestry to move forward on that in the near future. And if all of this residential infill, if the details of the residential infill policies are in place, and these particular codes are kind of done, is there anything the urban forest management plan can do to reconcile some of the ways in which residential infill may decimate canopy in the city? Is there any way, once this is set? I mean, these are two separate entities. This is one of the challenges I know that residents I talk to constantly bringing up about how the city is like, every bureau is working on their own thing. We do some conversations, but then one policy is passed and that nothing can be done with another policy because this one's already passed. And there's this like attempt to coordinate, but the frustration I'm hearing and I'm feeling is around the fact that something gets pushed through or gets voted on, approved here, but then there's nothing that can be revisited when an urban forestry management plan is being developed. So I'm wondering if there's any conversation going on about that to begin with. And I know these are separate things and that's part of the nature of doing this work, but nevertheless, just would love to hear any feedback on that kind of broad question.
I can take a stab at that, Vivek, and I might not be following you exactly, so help me out if I'm off track. But so the urban forest management plan is basically the city and community of Portland's vision for what its forest should look like. And then regulations are intended, Title 11 and others, to support that vision. Kind of like the climate action plan is a vision, then regulations are supposed to, and other things like education outreach are supposed to support that. And those, so really what I kind of heard in your question was more about regulations and folks, bureaus being on the same page with those. And a reminder, we will be beginning the update of the urban forest management plan, which is quite outdated. Planned for a soft start this calendar year. We're working on a hire to lead that work that we've never had before in urban forestry.
Okay. Yeah, I get the regulation piece. I guess there's just a few aspects of this that I wonder if even at the vision level will be challenged, generally speaking, particularly that conservation preservation issue of large form trees that we brought.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's tough to get everything we want in a city in the space we have. And just based on that alone, I would anticipate that, yes, content in the forest management plan will be challenging. For example, we know from our assessments that we could have up to 52% canopy cover in the city. So a city in a forest rather than a forest in a city. But right now our goal as a city is 30%. So that'll be part of the management plan conversation rather than regulations.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
I have to jump off. I'm sorry. I have a hard stop now. And so we'll need to conclude the meeting.
Yeah,
right?
we need to close up as well.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Matt. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, whole BPS team, Jeff, Marisol.
Thank you.
I'm really grateful for you.
Thanks,
Your
Bill.
presentation. We'll follow up likely by email, and commissioners, hoping I see coming down the pike with residential infill. So hopefully we can keep this conversation going. Thanks all for joining today. Looking forward to chatting again soon, and take care.